Okay. Yes, I was hoping to introduce myself when once we get started, but
Yeah.
my accent is a mixed match because I was born actually in Uruguay in South America to an Italian father and Hungarian origin mother. But I moved back to Europe very early on. I lived in Italy, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, where else? In Germany, and then I moved to the US. So people have a hard time sometimes placing it because I
Okay.
picked up.
Let me interrupt you because we need for you to do that once
Oh,
more.
I will introduce myself once we get started.
Okay.
That's not a
All
problem.
right. So welcome everyone. This afternoon we're going to have a talk from researcher and iconographer Elisa Markhoff, and I'm sure it's going to be an interesting conversation. The reason I'm sure of that is because Eva Ryder invited me to an event about 2 weeks ago in which I already heard this. But I would love, the reason we're doing this is I really loved what I heard from Elisa, and I wanted to share it with the world. And Elisa, go ahead. Go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us what Sophia is about.
Thank you, Skip. Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's really a pleasure to be here. Skip, you did attend, I think you saw at least one of my Fiery Angel series, right? At least the last
Yes.
one.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I've done 3 of those, and we've gone really deep into the history of Sophia, but more of that in a minute. Do you want me to start sharing my screen now or share
Yeah,
it
you
later?
can start anytime you're ready to go.
Okay, so I'm going to press the button here, and you tell me if you see it all right.
Yes, we do.
Okay. All
Perfect.
right, so this is the first slide that I shared before. I have to say that I'm very happy to see several people here who were in the Fiery Angel series. I will not give the exact same chat, not to bore anybody, but I am going to do this with a deep respect for all religious traditions. So I was raised Catholic. I do iconography, which is a tradition that these days is mostly within the Orthodox Church. But I want to present this material as a researcher. It's an interdisciplinary research. So there will be controversial areas when I speak, and then I am going to ask you to please go to the sources, which I'm happy to share with you. And I assume, Skip, that we will have a Q&A at the end, right?
Yes. Yes, correct.
Perfect. So let me see how I can move this presentation. There we are. So that's me. That's my official nice picture. So my name is Elisa Markhoff. I am a journalist and I am a researcher. And for many years, I worked as a foreign correspondent for South American newspapers while I was living in Europe, doing mostly cultural and social issues. I also have worked for radio as doing production and for TV as well. And I was born in Uruguay in Latin America to a Hungarian mother and an Italian father. And I moved back to Europe in my early 20s. I did live for a year in Italy when I was in my teens. But anyway, that's why I was telling before we started that my accent sometimes is a bit hard to pin down because I picked up bits and pieces here and there. Nowadays, I am living in the US, and this is where I am sitting right now in my office here in the US, in the East Coast. So I am also an iconographer. I was always interested in the sacred arts. I went to a Catholic school, and I was one of those children who prefer going to the chapel instead of taking recess outside. I love the silence. I love the sacred images. And as an adult, I started learning more about the history of the sacred arts, and I am an iconographer myself. So overall, I'm quite a curious person. My work is very much influenced by the work of Marian Woodman. I discovered Marian when I was in my 30s. Those of you who do not know about Marian Woodman, she was a Canadian analyst. She was of the Jungian line, of course, and her work has influenced me deeply. Actually, the first time that I heard about Sophia was in her books. Marian doesn't have a book that is about Sophia per se in itself, but Sophia seems to be what permeates all her work. And I believe that there's more about Sophia in her audios, in her interviews, than what there is in her books. When I attended my first Marian Woodman event, I was in Pacifica several years ago. I believe it's now 5 or 6 years ago. And I was very touched because when the event starts, the gathering starts, the first thing that the leadership does is set up a little altar, which is lovely, and light a candle and do a prayer, an offering to Sophia. So that touched my heart very much. And the work that I'm going to present is also going to be very much influenced by her. So I'm putting this here in the beginning so you know where, what permeates my research. Last July and August, I started doing a series of webinars on Sophia. It was called The Fiery Angels, Early Images of Sophia in the Sacred Arts. And I offered 3 classes so far. I also offered a history of the early Christian art, which is very much related to the story of Sophia. Because a lot of times when I hear talks in the Jungian world about Sophia, there's a lot of focus on the Gnostics, which is fine. But there is this idea that Sophia only appears in the Gnostics, or the divine feminine only shows up in the Gnostics. And when you go into the history of the early church, you realize that it's much broader than just the Gnostics. And that's part of what I'm going to present today. I know that we will be focusing on the Eastern Church, and you asked me to speak mostly about iconography, and I will do that, but we do need to touch first on the early church to understand how Sophia gets to the Eastern Church first. When I received an email from you, Skip, after my presentation, you told me that, and I'm quoting you here, you wanted me to talk about the emergence of Sophia in the Eastern churches and how I see the process continuing to emerge in the 21st century, particularly in Christianity. So these are big topics, and I'm going to try to cover a lot of these in this 40-minute talk, but I do also want to make sure that we have enough time to have a conversation afterwards. So I am going to concentrate on Eastern representations of Sophia, and we will spend a lot of time talking about Hagia Sophia and the Sophia icons of Novgorod. Do not worry if you haven't heard about this before, because you will learn about it today.
Yes, Elisa, please don't worry about a time. We normally set aside about 2 hours for this, so there's not a limitation of 40 minutes for you.
Okay, well, I planned it for around 40 minutes, so that allows for deeper conversation at the end, hopefully.
Terrific, wonderful.
That is my intention. I hope.
Wonderful. Okay.
Perfect.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, please interrupt whenever you think that it's necessary. So in order to begin, we need to define first what is East and what is West. I would like at least to have a brief discussion on sophiology, because if we are going to speak about Sophia, there are several sophiology movements, and we need to understand what these are, because depending on who is speaking, their presentation of Sophia is going to be influenced by one or the other movement. And then, of course, what I want to concentrate on is what are the images of Sophia in the sacred arts, if there are any, right? So what is East and what is West? I love maps. Maps are my best friends. And I am showing you here a map of the Mediterranean. And you will see that there are some cities that are highlighted in green. Those cities used to be the main cities of the early church, what were called at the time the sees. The Judeo-Christian tradition is really, by geographical definition, an Eastern phenomenon. It is not a Western phenomenon. It started in the Middle East. And from the Middle East, from what we have here, the Holy Land, you can see my cursor, right, Skip? You can see my cursor moving. Okay, perfect. So it starts here in the Middle East, and then it's going to spread towards Egypt, to what is Alexandria, to what is the Sinai Peninsula. And in this area here, we will have, for example, the Desert Fathers. And then it spreads to the north to Syria, to Damascus and Antioch. Here there's going to be a huge Christian community the first years. And then it will spread towards Rome. We will skip, of course, what is nowadays Turkey and Greece, just because those areas were very pagan areas. So there are some smaller communities, but the next big focus is going to be Rome. And it doesn't start in Rome itself. It starts outside of Rome in Ostia, which is the harbor, because these are going to be immigrants and they are going to be bringing with them their beliefs. So these are going to be the first centers. And this is going to be happening in the first 300 years of the church's history. What we speak about when we talk about the early church is what is defined by scholars as the great church. So the great church is geographically, ethnically, and culturally very diverse. We have this idea that there was Jesus, he dies on the cross, then the apostles go out and they spread the word, and then the Roman Empire converts to Christianism. It is not that fast and it is not that straight. It's going to be a process in which there's a very porous society. There's going to be what is called a half pagan, half Christian society for many, many years, for centuries. This early church, what we call the Great Church, was very loosely organized. So for many centuries, there was no ordination. This becomes very important for my research for several reasons. First of all, because when it comes to the role of women, if there was no official ordination, it's very easy to say women were not priests or women were not deacons. Well, of course they weren't, because there was not a standardized system to ordain them, but they were leaders. And we do have a lot of research that points to how active women were in the early church, not only in the first 300 years, but even until the 6th, 7th century. Because when we talk about Hagia Sophia, one thing that was built, when Hagia Sophia was built, there was the consideration of building an area for the women deacons to be active. So the role of women in the church has been quite big for more than 300 years and beyond. So this question of ordination and loose organization of the early church becomes very important. And it's going to become important in the separation between East and West, because a lot of us, especially if you went to Catholic school like I did, we hear this story that, Peter goes to Rome, the apostle Peter goes to Rome, and in Rome, he becomes the first pope. Well, he does become a leader, but he doesn't become the first pope because there is no ordination. And one of the claims that Rome held over the rest of the other seats is that they were ordained, they had Peter becoming the first pope. So that's why I'm mentioning it now, because when you go and you do research into the history, there are a lot of gray areas. And so you can arrive to a conclusion to one side, or you can arrive to a conclusion that is opposite to that. It really depends on which author you read and which bell you hear. It's not that one is wrong and the other one is right. It's really a question of how you are interpreting the data. Another thing that is important about this early church, this great church, so we said that it was geographically, ethnically, and culturally diverse. We said that it was very loosely organized, is that there really is no Bible. There is no canon. In this early church at this time, it wasn't like today that, you can Google things on internet, that you had a print and you just printed a Bible. There was no Bible. There were loose texts. There was a collection of letters, a collection of prayers, and even the Hebrew Tanakh hasn't been officially created at this time. So it depended on which group of Christians you were talking to which gospels or to which letters or to which prayers they had been exposed to. It was very diverse. But because this was an emerging religion, what was important to them is that they all believed in Jesus and that Jesus was the Messiah. So in the beginning, they tried to minimize the differences and, we all believe in Jesus. But as the centuries pass and Christianity becomes an official religion, or it becomes associated with an empire or with the religion of an emperor, what's going to happen is that we need an official story. And in order to have an official narrative, that is going to mean that alternative narratives are going to be turned into heresy. So in the beginning, if you believed in Jesus and you thought he was a really nice human being, that was fine. If you believed that he was divine, that was also fine. If you believed that he was half divine and half human, that was also fine. But once the church starts having councils, they need to have only one definition of who Jesus was. And that means that the ones that believed something that was different are going to be left out or are going to be considered heretics. And this is an important point to bear in mind. So because of all of this, if you look at the map, for many, many centuries, we have a religion that is very loosely organized, and there is no clear division between East and West. In fact, the church is going to have a schism, a separation between East and West only in the year 1054, not before that. So think about that. Everything that happened before the year 1054 is officially both East and West. But what's going to happen that is important for us is, okay, Jesus dies on the cross, the apostles go and spread the message, they get to Rome, and it's going to we'll have to wait 300 years until the arrival of Constantine. Constantine is an emperor that he converts himself to Christianism in the year 312. What is important here is that he doesn't convert the empire to Christianism. He only converts himself. And so paganism continues to be an official religion of the empire. And now what he does is just, he passes the Edict of Milano, which means that he creates religious tolerance for Christianity. But Christianity does not become the official religion. And this means there is still going to be a dialogue between paganism and Christianism because they are going to coexist. Constantine becomes emperor in the year 324. Until then, there was a system of 4 emperors, and then they started killing each other off, basically, and Constantine emerges as the victorious one in the year 324. And then Constantine does something that is very controversial and very shocking for the Romans, is he decides to move the capital from Rome, so the capital of the Roman Empire is moved from Rome to the city of Byzantium that he calls Nova Roma. We know this city later as Constantinople, so people call it Constantinople, but the official name was Nova Roma. So he basically moves the capital of the empire. And this is where trouble starts, because the Romans are not happy with this for several reasons. First of all, they feel rejected because there is an upcoming community of Christians in Rome, very large. Second of all, it has to do with taxes. If Constantine wants to create a new capital in Constantinople, in Nova Roma, that means that the tax money of the taxpayers in Rome is going to be diverted into this brand new city. That is a problem too. And Constantine, of course, is going to build temples for the Christians in Rome, but he's going to put most of his money in Constantinople. So that's where trouble starts relatively early on. By the way, Constantinople is what we know today, Istanbul is in Turkey. So there is a certain resentment of the Romans. The other claim that the Romans have is that Constantinople has no biblical importance. If you look at biblical text, all Hebrew texts that are now included in the Old Testament, there is mention of Alexandria, there is a mention of Damascus, of course, Jerusalem, but Constantinople is a new city. There's nothing about Constantinople. So from the very beginning, the Romans contest the existence of Constantinople as a center of faith. And this is going to be actually the main reason why in the year 1054, there's going to be a split, because from the beginning, there was a certain degree of animosity. Even though there was some animosity, they are going to all be the same church for several centuries. So I need to mention this because when we talk about art, it's not going to be Eastern art, or not considered to be Eastern art, until the year 1054, when they officially split. So what's going to happen in the year 1054 is that the West is going to see itself as the universal heirs of Jesus. So universal means Catholic, and the East is going to see itself as the true path that has always been there, thus Orthodox. And that's when they are going to part ways. So until then, we have to speak of a common theology, of a common set of values, and of a common artistic expression. And that's going to be important for us in terms of Christian art and where we find Sophia, because Christian art until the year 1054 is not going to be really divided into East and West, even though we can speak of, certain influences in different areas. For instance, there's going to be Coptic art. Some areas are going to have more of a Byzantine style. And here I'm showing you 3 examples. To the very left, you are seeing the Madonna della Clemenza. This is in Rome, and it dates from the 7th century. Then we see Christ Pantocrator here in the middle. This is an icon from it's nowadays in Egypt, but it's in the monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai Peninsula. It was probably produced in Constantinople, it's not clear, but this is where we find it today, and it is from the 6th century. And then we see a mosaic to the right, that is the mosaic of Empress Theodora, and this is in the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna in the 6th century. So here you have Rome, you have Egypt, and you have Ravenna, and this is all considered, Christian art, even though it comes from different parts of the empire. So when we are going to speak about Hagia Sophia today, in our minds, we think of it as Eastern, but at that time, it was Roman art. It was considered part of the Roman Empire, and this definition of the Byzantine Empire being called Byzantine only started in the 19th century. So if you were to travel in time and you could go to Nova Roma, to Constantinople in the 4th century, in the 6th century, and you would ask them, am I in the Byzantine Empire? The people would tell you, no, you are in the Roman Empire. They didn't even know the word Byzantine. So let's bear that in mind, because in terms of artistic representation, that is going to be important for us. So having said this, let's think about Sophia now. When we talk about Sophia, we usually associate her with divine wisdom and perhaps with a feminine presence in the divine. But this divine presence of a female entity is usually associated to some kind of belief system, and that is called Sophiology in most cases. But there are different types of Sophiologies. There is not just one Sophiology, there are different types. For example, we have psychological points of view, we have theological points of view, and we also have esoteric points of view. Some of them are better known than others. For instance, I find that the Jungians in general are very proficient in what is the Gnostics. They like the Gnostics. They are less proficient, for instance, in what is the Sophiology coming from Russia, which is having a comeback now, and I'm going to speak briefly about that. But I am going to show you now and speak very briefly about different types of Sophiology and people who were influenced about Sophiology. So the first one that we see here to the left is Jacob Böhme, who lived in the 16th, 17th century. He was born in 1875, so basically he lived most of his life in the 17th century. And he was a German mystic. He influenced many of the Russian thinkers, even though he lived in the 17th century in Germany. And he has influenced also many people in the West. So that is why I mentioned him. But he's one of the main Sophiologists of the relatively more modern period. The person that you see in the middle is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. He was a philosopher and a Jewish Catholic priest. He's quite well known. He wrote a hymn to the eternal feminine. He also wrote an essay on the soul of the world. And he taught in Paris mostly, but he also taught in Egypt, in Cairo. And Marian Woodman actually cites him relatively often. She liked some of his writing. So I don't know if Marian got most of her interest of Sophia through him or through Jung directly. They were both influenced by Sophiology. In the case of Jung, he does write about Sophia in his Psychology and Religion, West and East, and that is the volume 11 of the collective works, if anybody wants to look that up. And so all of them have similarities in terms of their Sophiology, but they also have differences. So it really depends whom you're reading, whether they're going to arrive to one conclusion or another, or whether the person is a priest or not, or if they are a theologian or not. In terms of the Russians, the one that are making a comeback now, I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about them. So the first Russian that we know that kind of like got the Sophiology movement started is the person that you see here to the very left of your screen, and that is Soloviev. He was born the year 1853 and died in the 1900s, so a relatively short life. He was very mystical. He had his first vision of Sophia when he was only 9 years old, and he traveled quite a bit for somebody of his time. He traveled to London, he went to Egypt, and when he was in Egypt, he had additional visions of Sophia. He did read Jacob Boehme's writing, and apparently he was also familiar with some Gnostic writings.
Could you say his name again? Because I could not clearly hear it.
His name is Soloviev. Soloviev.
Soloviev.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure. So he saw Sophia as a feminine presence. Not everybody who is a Sophiologist is going to put a huge emphasis on Sophia being the divine feminine. A lot of them, especially Catholic ones, are going to be more interested in the relationship between Sophia and Christ. I have to say that. In the case of Soloviev, he really was a mystic. And the only reason why he wasn't sanctioned by the Orthodox Church is that he was someone who was in the periphery, and they didn't think him important enough to make a fuss about him and go after him, sanctioning him. So he was off the radar, basically. But his writings do influence other writers later on. Pavel Florensky was another Sophiologist that is very well known. I don't have a picture of him here. He was born in 1882 and died in 1937. And we need to think of what was happening in Russia in these years, because these are important years for the Russian folk. We have first the war with Napoleon, then we have the end of the empire, the killing of the Tsars, the communist revolution. So a lot of things are happening in Russia. In terms of Florensky, he attended the Theological Academy. He was forced to teach science after the communist revolution, and he ended up being deported to a concentration camp in Siberia, and then nobody ever heard of him again. The only reason why he wasn't sanctioned by the Orthodox Church in his case is when he presented his work to the commission that was going to publish it, he omitted the chapter on Sophia. He left that chapter out. And so his work was approved, and then the chapter was included when he took the material to press. And then he influences other writers. Probably the best known these days, and the one that is becoming more popular these days, is the one that I'm circling here in the middle, and this is Sergei Bulgakov. Sergei Bulgakov lived also around the same time, was born in 1871 and died in 1944. And he is the one that is influencing and has influenced many people more, and you will understand why in a minute. So Bulgakov is familiar with the work of Florensky, familiar with the work of Soloviev. The interesting thing about him is that he was the son of a priest. He believes in Marxism in the beginning, but after the revolution, he's a bit disillusioned and he becomes a priest himself. But the interesting part for us is that because of the revolution, he emigrates in 1922 and he moves to Paris, to France. And Paris, France is going to become a huge center for emigres, for Russian emigres. For instance, Chagall was part of this emigre group in Paris. But what's going to happen is that the West is going to have exposure to Russian ideas through this group of people that have emigrated to Paris. The other thing that is going to happen is that Paris was never a traditional center of orthodoxy. And so there are going to be some tensions between the Orthodox world that is in Russia and that is being suppressed by the communist government and what is happening outside of Russia, because who gets to decide who is the representative of the religion when you cannot be, living your religion in the country where it's coming from? So when we talk about Bulgakov's ideas, it's never going to be about himself only and his theology. It's always going to be, influenced by the historical time and by the tensions, the political tensions and theological tensions that are happening between these different centers. So Bulgakov is going to write about Sophia. And he's going to write a book in English. He doesn't write in Russian. His book about Sophia was written in English. And trust me, if you read the book, you will realize that he wrote it in English. Somebody didn't translate him. So it can be a bit obscure sometimes. And he's interested in the relationship between the feminine of Sophia and the Logos, Christ the Logos, but he always mentions the feminine nature of Sophia. What's going to happen is that Bulgakov is going to travel, and he goes to London for conferences, and all he does is talk about sophiology. And so at one point, there's going to be tensions with the Orthodox community, and he's going to be tried. There's going to be a commission that is going to look into his work and decide whether he is a heretic or not. So they send his work to this commission, and the commission works on it for years. But we also have to think what time frame we have. We're talking about the 1930s, and there's the Second World War coming, so they had other things to worry about. But in the end, I think it's 1937 that the commission finally reaches a conclusion, is they do not found him to be a heretic. So they say that, the accusation of heresy are unjustified, and while he should think twice about his sophiology, he is never repudiated. So his theology is never repudiated by the church, and he's never asked to make a public renunciation of his sophiology. And I do think this is an important point, because many Catholic priests or thinkers are going to base themselves on the sophiology of Bulgakov, saying that, well, this was never repudiated by the church, so we do have a right to look into this and to build into this. What happens at the same time that Bulgakov is doing his work on sophiology? This is the third person that now becomes important for us, and this is Leonid Ouspensky. Leonid Ouspensky is not a sophiologist. He was a Russian emigre in Paris, a little bit younger than Bulgakov. And he was an artist, but he was never into religious art until he moves into Paris, and he becomes interested in iconography. And he becomes really interested in it. Remember, this is a special time for all these people. They have left their homeland. There's a huge soul search for meaning, for, the war is coming. Who are we? Who are we as Russians? Who are we as human beings living through this horror? So it's a very particular time in history. But in any case, Ouspensky is going to write a book about iconography, and he's going to write it in French. It's called L'Icône, Vision du Monde Spirituel, and that comes out in 1948. And then there's a publication of his work in English, The Meaning of Icons, that is published in 1952. Why am I saying this? Because this is one of the most known works of iconography to the West. So that he becomes kind of like the standard for the West to rediscover the Russian art of iconography. So what's going to happen now is that Bulgakov's ideas become popular again, not just because of Bulgakov, because the West rediscovers iconography, the West rediscovers, what's happening in Russia and what could be happening in Russia if the communists weren't there. So there's this very special, cultural moment going on. I have to say that Ouspensky is not loved by the Orthodox, because they think he, as every emigre, when you emigrate from your country, you tend to romanticize some things and put your own take on things that people that stayed in your country see differently. So he's not particularly loved by the Orthodox necessarily who do iconography, but he becomes fundamental to the West and how the West sees iconography. And of course, the works of Bulgakov and the works, this Ouspensky bringing iconography forward are going to influence other people. So for instance, Thomas Merton, he writes a poem called Hagia Sophia. He writes about Sophia as a feminine present, and Merton was familiar with the work of Bulgakov. He was very familiar with it. Of course, Marian is familiar with Sophia through Jung and probably through Teilhard de Chardin. And we also know that Jung had read Bulgakov at least through his friend Henry Corbin. So all of them are exposed to these ideas through the people that I showed you before. So I think it's important to mention this historical milieu, because otherwise we only mention people like, this person knows about Sophia and these people mention Sophia, but we need to understand in what context they talk about Sophia. And they are, of course, going to influence many, many other people that come after them. So at this point, I hope you don't have a Sophiology salad in your head, because there's all these different people with different ideas and different takes. We need to move forward then to the images of Sophia, but we need to understand that those images of Sophia are going to be not tainted, but colored by what was happening historically in all of these places. So who is Sophia? I personally believe that art is a record of belief. So when we see an artistic representation that is telling us something of the culture and of the person that depicted it, and this is going to be our the way that we are going to be looking at the images. So the first image that maybe to some of you that comes to mind when I say Sophia is this one here, or most people, not necessarily the Jungians, but to most people you say Sophia, and they tend to think of this kind of like Hellenistic style of Sophia, Sophia as wisdom, Sophia associated to philosophy, Sophia associated to ideas, right? So not necessarily wisdom, but more knowledge. This image here in particular comes from the library of Celsus in Ephesus, which is today in Turkey, and this image is from the year 117 AD. So this type of Sophia that most people tend to associate her with is related to philosophy. It's not necessarily the Sophia that we are going to focus on, but it's the one that is probably most known to the layperson. In the West, however, there were many people that were interested in Sophia, and one of them is Hildegard von Bingen. Hildegard von Bingen does a series of illuminations that contain several images of Sophia. And if you can't see Sophia here, look at this red circle. That is Sophia. This red circle is Sophia. You see her head here, and there's Christ, then there's Sophia's head, then there is Sophia's body and Sophia's feet. She is fiery, she has this fiery color, and she is the circle that encompasses all creation. So she's very clearly a creatrix of the world in this illumination from Hildegard von Bingen. We need to remember that Hildegard von Bingen was born in the year 1078 and she died in 1179. So that means that this is just right after the separation of East and West Church. That means that she was influenced by what was happening in the East until that time. So there was more fluidity of, of material going back and forth between the two churches. And then, of course, most of us, when we think about Sophia, I mean, many of us know about the Sophia that is in the Capella Sistina in the Vatican in Rome. This image is iconic because of the almost contact between God and the human figure here. But if you look to the right, God is holding someone very firmly, apparently, and that is, according to many authors, this is a representation of Sophia. But this is a very different Sophia than the ones that we saw before. She is, first of all, she's naked. She's under the firm grasp of God. I don't think she's moving much from there. She can't. And she comes, of course, in the height of humanism during the Renaissance. So it's a very different take on the Sophia that we are going to look at today. If we compare this Sophia to this one here, well, there's almost no comparison. This image here is, by the way, from the Kremlin. This is a fresco that is outside the Church of the Dormition in the Kremlin, and this is from the 17th century. But this Sophia here is sitting on a throne. She is sitting on an orb here. Her feet are resting on a foot stand that is an orb that represents the world. She has a staff, she has a crown, she has a halo, she has wings, and she has an orb behind her, the orb of creation. So she is absolutely regal. Compare this Sophia to the one that we saw before. If I didn't tell you that it's the same entity, you would not relate them at all, because there's a different conception of Sophia. And so we are going to focus more on this type of Sophia. How did we get to this Sophia here? Because this is the Sophia that, at least for the Jungians, for Marian Woodman, was the real deal. And we will see why in a minute. So why are they so different? Because it depends on your sources, depends on what characteristic of Sophia you are focusing on. Traditionally, throughout history, throughout the many centuries, Sophia has been an entity of very different definitions and very different interpretations. And a lot of people tell me, like, Well, but then let's look at the Bible. Let's look at what Sophia is in the Bible. And then my question becomes, okay, which Bible? Which Bible are you talking about? Because there are different Bibles, there are different sacred texts, there are, there's different versions, different traditions. There are texts that are now considered non-canonical, but are still influential. There are texts that are considered heretical that, have this descriptions of Sophia. So it really depends. And the main thing is going to be that when Christianity becomes the religion of the empire, and this is going to be much after Constantine only just allowed the religion to be practiced, then we will have the need for one narration, one official story, and then other stories are going to be left out. So some stories of Sophia, some texts that contain very important elements of Sophia are going to be left out of the Christian Bible or of the Hebrew text of the Tanakh. They're going to be left out. In any case, in all these texts, if we put all these texts together, we will see that Sophia appears as a co-creator with God. She is also described as a heavenly queen. Sometimes she's a messenger from God. Sometimes she's even God's lover in the Solomon tales. She is also represented as a teacher. She is represented as the law in many cases. And sometimes she's even described as a tree. Well, is Sophia God? Yes and no. There is no text in any biblical text or in any of the sacred texts that says very specifically that Sophia is not God. But there are texts that do say that she is. So for us, this is important to bear in mind. So where do we look for her in the traditions? Well, every time we talk about Sophia with the people that I know in the Jungian world, they either mention the Gnostics or they mention this proverb here in which she says, wisdom has built her house. Everybody knows this one. Wisdom has built her house. The house has 7 pillars. She has mixed the wine. She has set her table. This is the most popular one. But there are many, many, many different places where we can find writings about Sophia. The most known ones is what is called today the wisdom tradition, that were originally, part of the Old Testament. They were part of Judeo-Hebrew texts, but they were left out of the Judeo tradition. So they are no longer part of the, I see something coming up here. Skip, do you see any, I don't know. I'm going to continue. If you don't interrupt me, Skip, then I assume that everything is okay. So basically, all these different books, the book of Proverbs, the book of Job, the book of Kohelet, the book that was written by Jesus, son of Sirach, the wisdom of Solomon, and the writings of Philo of Alexandria, they all have information on Sophia. But depending on which one you look at, Sophia is going to appear in one light or another. In some of them, the language is going to be extremely erotic, which is like in the Wisdom of Solomon. And in others, Sophia is going to appear more related to law and justice. Now, all these books, when you look at them, you say Wisdom of Solomon, oh, this was written in the time of Solomon. It's not like that. Most of these books were written either many years or many centuries after the time that they are describing. So we need to bear all of this in mind when we think about Sophia, because this has an influence of how Sophia is being seen. So Sophia is being portrayed differently in each of these traditions, and it's really hard to pin her down because depending on where we look, she's going to have one characteristic of another. To make things more complex for us, the Hebrew people of the Old Testament were nomads. We know that they moved from one area to the other. And for many centuries, they had periods of exile. They were exiled in Egypt, they were exiled in Babylon. And when they were exiled, they incorporated aspects of the local cultures, particularly of the local deities. Now, this is not just my opinion. I am basing this on work of Joseph Campbell, for instance. He talks a lot about this. So there are many sources that cite this. In any case, Sophia in the wisdom tradition is going to incorporate many elements of the Egyptian goddess Maat, which we see here represented. She's the one that has the feather, and she allows the people to travel to the underworld and to reach the other side if their hearts have been pure. So Maat holds the feather to weight the person's heart and to see how this person did in life. And she is related to the cosmological order and the justice. Then they also incorporate elements of Ishtar and Inanna. And these are going to be many erotic aspects of Sophia. So when we talk about the Book of Solomon, we can clearly see that a lot of the language of prayers and texts that come from Babylon have been incorporated into that text. And I want to emphasize the importance of doves, because in the religion of Inanna and Ishtar, they were represented as doves. And when we look at Sophia as the Holy Spirit, traditionally, the Holy Spirit is represented as a dove. So there is a huge connection there. I don't have time now to talk about this because I would need a good hour and a half extra. But
I'm sorry, though, I don't understand the word that you're saying. They're represented as what?
As a bird, a dove. Dove.
Dove. Okay.
Okay, yes. So that is the representation. She's represented as a bird.
Yeah, okay, as a dove, and is the way I would normally pronounce that. So that's why.
Okay, okay, the pronunciation is dove?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so that's what she is, a dove. And we are going to see that this association between a bird and Sophia continues in the 6th century and beyond. And finally, we have the goddesses that are in the area of Canaan here, which are local goddesses. And in particularly, there is an author called Margaret Barker. She has done a lot of research on what she calls temple theology. I do recommend that you look her up and you read her books, because she puts out enough evidence to show that there was actually also a female deity within the Hebrew people that was worshipped alongside Yahweh. So we tend to think that in the Bible there is only one God, Yahweh, but there were several gods. There was El, there was Yahweh. This is also studied by Karen Armstrong. And then there is one period of unification in which it becomes only one God, and we can really speak about monotheism. But before that, apparently, there used to be a female deity alongside the male deity. And she gives enough evidence towards that, archaeological evidence and also linguistic evidence. And this is really exciting to look into. An example of how this integration works. So it's easy to say, well, you know, Sophia incorporates elements of Maat, and she incorporates elements of Ishtar and Inanna. How does that happen? The other day I was watching PBS. I like watching documentaries. And there was this documentary on Nova about the history of writing. And they show this Sphinx here, which if you can see, I'm going to point here, it has some text written on her, okay? And there is another view of her with text written here in hieroglyphs. So this is the Egyptian language. And the language that you see here is a different language that they had to discover. So they had to decode this language. What is important for us in relation to Sophia and this fusion of deities is that this Sphinx here is a Sphinx of Hathor, so the goddess Hathor, okay? And in the Egyptian language, there is here, you know, a little text that is saying that this is for our beloved Hathor. However, the text that is written under it was written by people of Canaan that were living in Egypt at the time. And the people of Canaan that have this little statue, they're not going to call this goddess Hathor. So what they write down here is the name of their goddess. They write on this Sphinx of Hathor, they write to our beloved Baalat. So Baalat was the wife or the consort of the god Baal. So here you clearly see a Sphinx of Hathor that is called Baalat by a different culture. And this is what happens with the Hebrews. In reality, it's a similar process. You have the local deities and they are being incorporated to their own personal theology, their own personal mythology. So I'm happy that I discovered this example, because a lot of times these things sound very like theory, and we don't know how they happen, but this is how they happened. You know, in real life, people didn't have, it's not like today that we have so many images and so many statues and you can just go and buy a little souvenir. Images were hard to come by. And so when you had one, you were going to write your own God in it. You were not going to associate it with a local God, but you, at the time that you're writing your name in it, you are incorporating an aspect of it. So to continue, in this wisdom tradition, we see all these different images of Sophia. Sophia in the wisdom tradition is usually called Chokmah. And so this Sophia's Chokmah, she integrates the ancient Near East and Hellenistic goddesses. And she takes her life from the language, from the images, and also from the theology and the veneration of Maat, of Hathor, and of Isis, and of the erotic Syrian goddesses Ishtar and Inanna. So there's all these influences coming to Sophia. And that's why we said that she was so hard to pin down, because there's all these influences happening at the same time. As if this wasn't complex enough, we also have the question of language. There is a language barrier. So we know Sophia as Sophia, right? But as I said before, in the Hebrew texts, in those texts that are sacred, she was called Chokmah. Now, Chokmah is a feminine noun, so we associate her with a female entity. Then she gets translated into Greek as Sophia. That's also a feminine noun, that's great. But when we come to the writings of Alexandria, the ones that are written in the time of Alexandria, Sophia is actually written as pneuma, and that is a neutral noun. So she starts losing her feminine quality just by sheer translation. And then she gets translated when Christianity comes along and associates pneuma with the logos, then that becomes a masculine noun. And then, of course, the Spiritus Sanctus, the Holy Spirit, that is a Latin masculine noun. So we see this progression from being feminine to being associated with the masculine. And I don't think that this was really a conscious decision by someone. I think that this really did get lost in translation. So as you can see, I hope that the idea that you're getting is that it is really a complex issue. It's not straightforward. So we have the ancient goddesses that influence Sophia. And then with Christianism, we have Mary. Mary is going to be a huge figure in relation to Sophia. In fact, for many people that are exploring Sophia within Christianism, especially Catholicism, they talk about the Sophia Maria connection. Because what's going to happen is a lot of the characteristics that Sophia had in herself are going to be moved into Mary. So Mary is going to have now those characteristics. And Sophia kind of like gets a bit sidetracked. And then we don't find Sophia, we don't find writings on Sophia for a long time because these Sophia qualities have been incorporated into Mary until we get to the time of the building of Hagia Sophia. And this is when Sophia comes back into vogue. She becomes known again. She becomes popular again. So we spoke about Constantine, and we said that, he converted to Christianity, but didn't make Christianism the official religion. But Constantine was a very peculiar figure because he still continued to worship the pagan gods. So he was a huge worshiper of Apollo. He dedicates Nova Roma, Constantinople to Tyche, to the Nike goddess. He doesn't dedicate that to Christ or Mary. And he's a strategist. He knows that he needs to unify his empire because all the emperors that came before him were assassinated. So he needs to have everybody bonding together. And he sees Christianism really as an opportunity to have this religion that is up and coming, to use it as a bond between the people. So he's the one that proposes the creation of the councils of the church. It's Constantine's idea. He's like, okay, why don't we all get together here in Constantinople and we all come to an agreement about what we believe. But he's not a theologian. He's someone who's relatively simple-minded in terms of religion. He only cares about unity. So he thinks that these people of different areas, like there's representatives coming from Egypt, there's representatives coming from Syria, from Jerusalem, from Rome, and he thinks that they're going to sit there for 5 minutes and they're going to agree, and the opposite happens, of course. There's a very heated discussions in these councils. In any case, Constantine is believed to be the one that set the space for the first Hagia Sophia. Now, there are some authors that say, no, Constantine never thought that that church was going to be a church for Hagia Sophia, for divine wisdom. He just wanted to build a church there. Now, let me tell you that the cities at that time were fortified cities, so they couldn't grow. They were limited by the walls of the city. So if you have a really nice spot in the middle of the city, you are not going to leave that spot without a name. That spot is going to be your prime real estate place. And so he wants to put a really nice basilica there. So the first Hagia Sophia church was not the one that we know today. It had a basilica shape. Constantine dies relatively early. He is an emperor for too many years. He dies of natural causes, by the way. He's not assassinated. But in any case, it's his son who builds the basilica for Sophia. But there is enough evidence there to suggest that it was Constantine wanting to have a Sophia there. And because he's half pagan, half Christian, it makes sense that he sympathizes with the concept of Sophia. The Hagia Sophia that we know today, so here to the left, we see a bust of Constantine, and to the right, we see a mosaic of Justinian. So when Constantine left the Roman Empire, what we know today as the Byzantine Empire, was half pagan, half Christian. When Justinian leaves, the one that we see to the right, it is a fully Christian empire. We're talking already about the 6th century. And Justinian is very lucky because at the time that he leaves is the golden age of the Byzantine Empire. There's a lot of money, there's a lot of expansion. And in any case, he's lucky because the old basilica has a wooden roof and it catches fire and it burns down. So he has the opportunity to build a new church in that fantastic space. And he's the one that commissions Hagia Sophia as we know today. Now, this Hagia Sophia that we see here, this picture that we see, has the Muslim towers around it. It did not look like that when it was built. This is what I'm showing you now is an artist rendering, and it would have looked more like what I'm showing you right now here. And this new building, first of all, it's like a marvel of the world. It was built very, very quickly. I think, Skip, you told me that you were lucky enough to visit it
Yes.
when it was still open as a museum, because it has been turned back into a mosque this year for political reasons, not religious reasons.
Yeah.
But in any case, this was a marvel of the world. This building was built in only 5 years. It was in a structure that was not known to the time because they used to build in basilicas. And there you have these very sinuous spaces or concave forms. And it's called Hagia Sophia. So where is Sophia in this building? Because a lot of people ask me, well, show me the mosaics of Sophia in Hagia Sophia. And I have to tell them, well, we don't have any. We don't have any for 2 reasons, probably. The first one is that if there were any, they didn't survive. But most likely there weren't any because the church was built relatively quickly, so only 5-6 years to build it. There was no time to do a lot of decoration. And the mosaics that we know today inside Hagia Sophia were built after the iconoclasm, so they are from a later period. What we presume is that there were icons of Sophia in Hagia Sophia, and those icons didn't survive. The reason why we presume that is because when we talk about the Russian icons, a lot of times when the Russian icons were created, they said, following the model of the icons that are in Hagia Sophia. So maybe there were, maybe there weren't, we don't know of any. The way that Sophia lived in this Hagia Sophia is as a quality. Sophia was represented as a quality of light in this building. So what does that mean? It means that, as I said before, Sophia is an entity of different aspects. And in many biblical texts, Sophia is associated with the light. Sophia is the fiery one, is associated to lightning bolts. She's associated to the light of the creation. She's not just associated with wisdom, she's more of a creatrix than as the one that has wisdom. She has wisdom because she creates the world or co-creates the world with God. So inside Hagia Sophia, Sophia is present as the quality of light. If you visit Hagia Sophia today, it is a relatively dark building because it was turned into a mosque and there were several changes done to her. But the original building was extremely sensuous and all the mosaics gave a lot of light. It was known to have light until very late in the day. So that was how Sophia was present in Hagia Sophia. She was present as a quality. She was not present as a figure. So this church is built by Justinian in the 6th century. This is a marvel of the world. And of course, you have this fantastic church here and you call her Sophia. Well, the name Sophia starts catching on. Then other authors and other places become interested in Sophia. And that's how we see manuscripts talking about Sophia that start appearing in Italy and in other places or in other areas of the Byzantine Empire, in Sicily, in, you know, there are a lot of manuscripts that survive from the time. Those are the earliest manuscripts that we know of that have representations of Sophia, but they come after the building of this marble. Now, where do we see Sophia next? Well, we are going to see Sophia next in what we know today as Russia and the Ukraine, which was the old old Rus Empire. And what is the connection with this building? Well, the connection is that in the year 980 or so, there was a prince living in, in the old Russian Empire called Old Rus. And the main city at the time was Kiev. It's today in the Ukraine, but at the time it was part of Old Rus. And this prince, for several reasons, decides that they need to convert. He needs to convert, partly for looking for political alliances. And so he sends emissaries to all different religions, all different places, and he tells them, look for the best religion to convert. And of course, these emissaries who live in Kiev, which is a great city, but it's all built in wood, come on. And then they arrived in Constantinople and they see this building. They cannot believe their eyes. And the tradition says that Prince Vladimir ends up converting because of the beauty of Hagia Sophia. So Prince Vladimir converts to Christianism in the year 988, and this is known as the year of the conversion of the Slavs. We cannot speak about Russia at that time, so this is the conversion of the Slavs. And what is important about this is two things. First of all, this conversion is top down. So when we have Christianism, we have an emerging religion within the masses that eventually becomes the religion of the empire. What's going to happen in the Slavic lands in Old Rus is that the emperor, Prince Vladimir, decides to convert and he imposes a religion on everybody. But those people were pagans and they are not going to convert immediately. They are not going to give up on their pagan customs right away. In fact, it's going to take centuries and centuries. And what we see in what is today Russia is a very particular flavor of Christianity because there's a lot of paganism that ends up being incorporated. There's no other way otherwise that people would have converted to Christianism just because the Prince Vladimir said you have to. The other factor that is important for us is that there's this beautiful Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. So what do we want to have in Kiev? We want to have our own Hagia Sophia. So they build a Sophia Cathedral in Kiev, and they build Sophia Cathedrals in other cities that are part of Old Rus. So what's going to happen then for us is that the main focus for Sophia iconography and Sophia representations is going to move to the north. So we are going to leave Constantinople and we are going to move towards Russia here in the top. And I'm showing you here a map for those of you that might be confused as I was when I started with all of this. We have Constantinople down here. And so we have Kiev here, and this here used to be Kievan Rus, Old Rus. And the main cities for us are going to be Kiev, of course. That's where Prince Vladimir is, and he converts and he builds the first Sophia Cathedral in the north, in the Slavic lands. And the other city that is going to be important for us is Novgorod, which is more in the north. That's where the icons of Sophia, the best known icons of Sophia, come from. So we move from Constantinople, the Slavic people convert, they become Christian, their own particular flavor of Christianity, and they build their Sophia Cathedral. Now, what happens next is that, unfortunately, the Mongols are expanding and they sack the city of Kiev. So there's the Mongol conquest to the south, and they burn down Kiev. So the Sophia Cathedral survives, but there's a lot of damage to it. So there's not a lot that survives from the original Sophia Cathedral. We do know that there were no representations of Sophia. There is one mosaic of the Virgin Mary in this cathedral, and she has some elements that we could argue that it's a fusion between Mary and Sophia, but there is no icon of Sophia per se. So what happens is that the Mongols come, they sack Kiev, but the Mongols don't move to the north, because this whole area here where Novgorod is very near to where St. Petersburg is going to be founded several centuries later. But this area here is full of swamps. So it's not a really great area to build a city. It's full of water, it floods, and in summer it's full of mosquitoes. So the Mongols are not interested, so they stay in the south and they never move to the north. And that means that the Slavic culture can survive around Novgorod. This is what is important for us, that this is where the culture continues. Now, Novgorod becomes then the new center of importance for Orthodoxy. At the same time, what's happening is that there's a schism of the church, of course, and then there is going to be the Fourth Crusade sacking Constantinople. So the Byzantine Empire in the south and Constantinople are at the time of their decline. And as they decline, Orthodoxy really grabs hold of the Slavic lands. So first Kiev and then Novgorod. And in Novgorod, they did have their own Sophia cathedral early on. They built it in the year, I think it's like 1050 or so. But then the icons of Sophia are going to come from a time a little bit later, from the 15th century, the icons that are important to us. What is also interesting for us is Novgorod was a very rich city because it was part of the Hanseatic League. It was a city that lived from trading. It had excellent access to harbor, so there was a lot of money in Novgorod, and a lot of money means money to spend in the arts. So that's why there is a Novgorod school of iconography. There's a very important development of the arts in Novgorod. This is not just coincidence, it's because there was a lot of flow of money coming in. And in Novgorod, we are going to find the icons of Sophia that are important for us, such as this one here. This icon that you are looking at is one of the most famous icons of Sophia of the time. And this one is inside the Cathedral of Sophia. So the Sophia Cathedral has this icon inside. And now I would like to analyze this icon with you, because I believe it has very interesting elements to discuss. So what does this icon have that is important for us? Well, what this icon has is Sophia is in the center, of course. She is sitting on a throne. She has this footstool that is an orb. So she is sitting on top of the world. That means she is not just wisdom, but she is the creatrix. So we see this association with creation with her. She has a staff, which is a sign of power. She has a crown, she has a halo, and she has this orb behind her that has this bluish, greenish color, which is like, she is like the center of creation, basically. And interestingly enough, she has Mary on one side and John the Baptist on the other. Now, this is interesting because this is a construction that is known as a deesis. So usually if you look at icons of Christ, it's going to be Christ who is in the middle and who has Mary on the side and John the Baptist on the other. But in Sophia icons, she takes the central place. She does have a Christ here on the top, but that Christ on the top there is associated to her as a quality of the Logos. So this is more into theology. But what is important for us is that this Sophia seems to capture all the qualities that Sophia had in the old biblical text and the old sacred text. She has the fiery color. She is the fiery one. She has wings. Now, we tend to associate wings with angels, but we also associate wings with birds. And this is fundamental for us because the presence of elements of birds relates Sophia to two things. First of all, to the ancient Mesopotamian goddesses of Inanna and Ishtar. And remember where Russia is placed. Russia did have a lot of influence of paganism coming from Babylon, from the south, from Iran. but also it relates Sophia to the pagan deities that are present in Russia at the time. This is something that I'm going to talk more in a future webinar because I find it fascinating. But in any case, this Sophia as wisdom has all the qualities of a female deity that is related to creation. She is at the center. She has the fiery color. She has the staff, all the symbols of power. And as if that wasn't enough, we see here on the top that there is the table laying the Eucharist out. And depending on which biblical text you consult, you will see that before Christ is associated with the bread and the wine, there was an association of Sophia with the bread and the wine, and of ancient goddesses receiving offerings of wine and bread. So all these elements are present here. This type of Sophia icon is very particular to Novgorod, and they become the new standard of how to represent Sophia. So there is nothing like this that we know of from before. As I said, it could be that there were, but they haven't survived. So there is a theory that there were icons like this in Constantinople, in Hagia Sophia. We don't have any writings describing those icons, so we cannot know for sure. We do have treaties from Russia from the 15th century describing these icons here and mentioning these elements. So we know, this is what we know of them. This is a different icon. This one, if I'm not wrong, is hosted in the Russian Museum of Icons in Massachusetts here in the United States. So those of you who are free sometimes to visit, I think they are open already with all this COVID craze. They reopened and this icon can be seen there. But you can see the same elements present. Sophia in the center with the fiery color. She has this, she's sitting on the orb. In this case in particular, she has 7 pillars. If you count the pillars at the bottom, there are 7 pillars. She has the staff, she has the wings, she has the crown, she has the sphere behind her, and there is still the Eucharist present, and there is Mary on one side and John the Baptist on the other, meaning that she is a deity figure in a way, because this is a deicid and the main figure is in the middle. And so now I want to go back to the question that Skip asked me when he said, do you want to come and talk to my group? He said, well, what is the importance of this Sophia? How is she present for us today in religion, right? Particularly in Catholicism. Well, those icons of Sophia became important in Moscow, and we see them in Moscow in the 17th century, because there were some fires in Moscow, and when they decided to rebuild, because Novgorod was such an important city, they looked at the art of Novgorod, and then Sophia moved, the iconography was represented also in Moscow. But then Sophia kind of like dies out a little bit, because we have the time of Peter the Great, and Peter the Great wants to westernize Russia. So there aren't that many icons of Sophia produced. There is a revival of Sophia in the 19th century. And then we go back, of course, to what I said before of the Sophiology movements. But in her essence, throughout all these centuries, whether we like it or not, in all of these variations, Sophia has, for humans, fulfilled the need of a feminine presence in God, to one extent or another in different religions, but that she has done. And where is Sophia today in relationship to the church? Well, we do know that when Pope Francis became Pope, he's interested in iconography, and he commissioned an icon actually to have it put in the Vatican. Of course, there are many icons in the Museum of the Vatican, but he takes a particular interest in icons. So there is this icon of, this is Mary of the Silence, and he commissioned that icon, and he does regular blessings of icons. So here we see Pope Francis blessing Syrian icons. So there is really an intention from the Catholic Church to have more dialogue with other fractions of Christianism. Where does Sophia sit in all of this? Well, what I am showing you here now is a church in the Ukraine. And this is the Ukrainian Catholic University that has just opened a church, the Church of Sophia. And they commissioned this, this art here that is now in this Church of Sophia. This is the winning design that is done by a woman artist, Lyuba Yatskiv. And I have to say that within iconography, traditionally it was mostly men doing iconography, and now we're seeing kind of like the opposite. We see more and more women interested in iconography. And this is, of course, a Catholic church. It's not a Roman Catholic church. It's a Ukrainian church. But when I read an interview with the artist, and when they asked her what did she think about this icon, her answer was like, I think this is an icon that women will understand. And so I want to finish my presentation with this sentence. This is a representation of the sacred that we women can relate to. And this is, if we look at the people that are talking about sophiology these days within the Catholic world, their point of view is more, what they are exploring is, can God be represented in a maternal face? Can God be represented in a woman or a feminine entity, and why not? So this is how I really want to open the discussion now, because really in all other major religions, the divine has usually been represented by a couple. The divine marriage, you have a feminine aspect, a masculine aspect, and they form these hierosgamos, right? And that is the basis of all polarities. And that has been lacking in the religions of the Axis, or the religions that derive from Abraham, particularly in Christianism. And so what is our God image today? How is it evolving? And what space do we have for Sophia in this God image? And this is how I want to open up the discussion. And before I stop sharing my screen, I am giving you the name of my website. It's thefieryangel.academy. It's not .com, it's .academy. And if you are interested in my work, you can follow it there. You can subscribe to the newsletter, and I can keep you up to date with upcoming webinars. And now, Skip, I am handing this over to you again, and I don't know how to stop sharing my screen.
You seem to have done it.
Oh, okay, great.
So let me ask for questions and comments from the group. Nancy must have something.
Well, I am just thrilled with what you have shared with us, and you're so efficient in getting it all out in such a short time. My own personal experience is of both the masculine and feminine divine. So when you speak of Sophia as the divine, the co-creatrix, it certainly fits with my own personal experience. And I have read a dissertation in which the writer quoted a Jungian analyst as talking about this feminine side of the self. Now, I haven't read that anywhere else, but maybe some of you have read that. But there is that deep essential truth of the masculine and feminine as one. And I think of Hinduism, and Shakti and Shiva are considered one, but there's the masculine and the feminine, the deep silence, and then the creative aspect. So you've just thrilled me today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I mean, it's a fascinating topic, and I'm just doing it today through the lens of, the Christian tradition in a particular time period. But it is, I mean, it's like opening, I don't know, a Pandora's box, maybe, Sophia's box.
I would like to thank you. This was one most excellent. I had no idea about the Novgorod and going north. And I find that interesting, even from what I've experienced and learned, that it went silent for centuries. My parents were both professors of language, and I don't think they were aware of the Russian connection either. And so that, to me, opens up such a, I like that you use the word Pandora's box, the phrase Pandora's box, because after all of that leaves, she peers into the box, and there's a little golden fledgling hope is all that's left in the bottom of the box. So this, I feel like you've kind of given that golden hope in this conversation, and with so much wonderful information. And I will piggyback with Nancy. Your presentation was so excellent, and it was dense in such a way that was able to be digested and clear. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And Jordan, I mean, Skip, you are recording this, so you can go back as many times as you want. You know, that's the beauty of this. I think in terms of the Russian side, there's several issues. The first one is that there's a language barrier. We had, of course, all these years of communism, and then Russia is rediscovering its own traditions. So that also is in the way, of course. But there is a fascinating history. And for me, what is also fascinating is how paganism and Christianism interact in early Russia. Because, you know, when Christianity comes into the Slavic people, as I said, it's a top-down system, and people are not willing to give up their beliefs. So that's why that Sophia has that really rich opportunity to reclaim previous aspects, because it might look like it's late in the game for the rest of the world that is so embedded in Christianity, but for them, they had just discovered it. So the paganism is just, you know, that energy is still there. So there is a dialogue that is possible, and it's really reflected in the iconography, I feel.
Yeah, right. And that asks the question, thank you for the wonderful lecture. Just wondering about the connection between the Black Madonna and Sophia. I know in Ireland, where Annette lives, there are Black Madonna churches. And of course, there is one in Poland as well, because that was the church of John Paul II. Wonder if you comment on that.
That is a beautiful question, because it is true. I always describe these sacred images of the feminine as a spectrum, as if you would have the white light and you put it through a prism, and then you see a spectrum of colors. And in one color, you're going to find Sophia, and in another color, you're going to find Mary, and in another color, you're going to have the Black Madonna. They are all the same, but you know, we're looking at all of them and they look as if they are different. In Russia, I think the case is more interesting because they used to have a very deep connection with the earth, with the black earth, the black soil. Russian for the Russians is a feminine presence. And so the Black Madonna exists in Russia more as Mary, as what we see, for instance, in the West. So it's expressed differently. So Sophia goes more in the spectrum of the light, the creation. She has this, in German, the word is Leichtigkeit, which is kind of like, you know, something that flies. It's something light, right? Whereas the Black Madonna has that earthiness. So I do think that we are speaking about the same sacredness, but we are speaking about different places of the spectrum. That's the best way that I can express it, really.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. The things that have come to my attention as I've been studying Jungian psychology and some of these things is to find the feminine in a lot of places that I didn't know about. As a, you know, to the extent I had any sort of Christian education, it was always Protestant. And so there are a couple of aspects of that Protestant education that I've had. One was that every image I ever saw of the Sistine Chapel painting had Sophia cut out of it. Okay, in other words, it was cropped without Sophia. And so I think it's very interesting, and I do want to do a short biblical reading here for those that don't know, because Edward Edinger was emphasizing the emergence of feminine energy and Sophia as wisdom. And one of the key aspects of this is that in some Bibles, you find wisdom referred to as Sophia, but in others, the idea of a feminine individual or personage is worked out of the system. And so Edward Edinger brought to our attention chapter 8 of Proverbs from the 12th verse. to the 30, I think it's to 31 particularly, but I just want to read that section. I, wisdom, dwell with prudence and find out knowledge of witty inventions. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Pride and arrogance and the evil way and the froward mouth do I hate. Counsel is mine and sound wisdom. I am understanding. I am strength. By me, kings reign and princes decree justice. By me, princes rule and nobles, even all the judges of the earth. I love them that love me, and those that seek me early shall find me. Riches and honor are with me, yea, durable riches and righteousness. My fruit is better than gold, yea, than fine gold, and my revenue than choice silver. I lead in the way of righteousness in the midst of the paths of judgment, that I may cause those that love me to inherit substance, and I will fill their treasuries. The Lord possessed me in the beginning of his way, before his works of old. I was set up from everlasting, from the beginning, and ever the earth was. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no fountains abounding with water, before the mountains were settled, before the hills was I brought forth. While as yet he had not made the earth, nor the fields, nor the highest part of the dust of the world. When he prepared the heavens, I was there. When he set a compass upon the face of the depths, when he established the clouds above, when he strengthened the fountains of the deep, when he gave to the sea his decree that the waters should not pass his commandment, when he appointed the foundations of the earth. Then I was by him as one brought up with him, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in the habitable part of his earth, and my delights were with the sons of men. And that's in the Old Testament. And it troubles me that I never heard anything about that in my Christian religion. And one thing that does delight me of late is this book, The Radiant Sutras, which is by Lauren Roche. And Lauren has taken some Hindu texts and written about this same sort of idea. And so I want to read you a very brief part of the prelude to this book. It's based on a set of sutras called the Vijnana Bhareva. And Debbie, my wife, who's a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, if not a lama herself, because she's not ordained, but she did do a 3-year retreat, said, I was trying, when I found this book, I kept asking her, Debbie, read this book. You really have to look at this book. And she said, oh, I'm busy. I have to do this Buddhist thing. And I said, you have to look at this book. And she just wouldn't do it. She gets wandering that way sometimes. And so I went on Amazon and I had the book shipped to her, gift wrapped, and with a note in the book saying, you're going to need your own copy of this. So when she got it and started to read it, she said, oh my God, this is the tantras that the Buddhist masters always promise to teach, but never do. And so there's a couple of things here that are quite special, and the whole book is quite special as Lauren Roche has presented it. But in the prelude, it says, a language of love. The Bhareva Tantra is set as a conversation between the goddess, who is the creative power of the universe and the God who is the consciousness that permeates everywhere. For short, they call each other Devi and Bhareva, or Shakti and Shiva. They are lovers and inseparable partners, and one of their favorite places of dwelling is in the human heart. And when I read that, it made me think of Albert Einstein and E equals mc squared. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we all started to think more like that? And that's one of my particular interests in your work, Elisa, because of that. And this applies to both God and Sophia, but this is just 3 verses of Dr. Roche's translation of the Bhareva, of the Vijnana Bhareva. He says, elaborate rituals and garish images may be useful in meditation when your mind is whirling with thoughts of sex, money, and power, wandering like an elephant in heat. Go ahead and use these tools, yet no, beating drums and blaring trumpets cannot summon the one who is already present. I am not a collection of incantations known only to experts. I am not a ladder to be climbed, a sequence for piercing energy centers in your body. I am not to be found at the end of a long road. I am right here. And so there's 112 verses in the Bhareva, in the Vijnana Bhareva. This is Lauren Roche's translation of it, the Radiant Sutras, and I highly recommend it to you. But my point in reading all that is that the feminine is right here and has been right here, but it's a question of bringing it forward in a natural way. It's not carrying flags and having riots and so on. It's how can we bring the feminine forward so that all of us understand that it's right here and it always has been right here. And it's not a question of patriarchy, because the patriarchs have always known that women are the bosses in many ways. And so anyway, I'd welcome any comments on that. And,
Elisa, I just want to thank you very much. This was a wonderful presentation. For one thing, you clarified for me the concept or definition of Sophia, because having grown up Catholic, I was confused because, you know, we have the Madonna, you have Mother Mary, you have Magdalena, and then where does Sophia come in, and was she a disciple and so forth? But what really resonated with me, because my spirituality has gotten to the point where I embrace the all, is when you said that Sophia represents the quality of light. And when you said that it would be like the light coming through a prism and you break it up in such a spectrum of different aspects of light, that did it for me. Because for all different cultures, the word even Sophia doesn't even register for some people. But I think it's the divine feminine that we know without knowing is there. And it is the merging of the masculine and feminine that makes us whole and makes us one and makes us part of the divine, if not the part of us, but makes us divine. And that's what we're bringing forth. And this is what Skip's colloquium and lectures is all about, is bringing to the realization to everyone that we are the divine. And with that, I have a question, Elisa. Why is there not more women priests and sacred leaders out in the forefront in this 21st century?
Well, first of all, thank you, Charles. Thank you for your comment. I do think that the leaders are there. For instance, I was brought up in Latin America, and in indigenous community, women have a lot of leadership. So it really depends at what you're looking at and where you're looking at that leadership. If you're talking about the church in particular, for me, it was very helpful to realize that in the original church, there was a place at the table for women. That liberated me in many ways, because when you go to a Catholic church, and I am assuming that there's different types of theologies, and there's different schools where they teach you one thing or the other. But in general, the story that we hear is one in which the voice of the women is mostly silenced, or the voice of the woman is associated with suffering or with resilience or with motherhood only, and it's not necessarily associated with leadership. And so when we go back to history and we look at these things, and I didn't just check feminist authors, I also checked researchers, male researchers, Harvard professors, and they really put the evidence out there that these women existed and they had a voice and they were part of, the organization of the informal organization, let me call it that way, until it becomes, of course, they start to become left out. But it took really until after the 6th century. So you have 600 years in which women are present, and then they start being moved to the side. And to me, that is empowering. So I don't read that as a sorry story that we were moved to the side. I read that as we were there from the beginning, and that is where we belong. So that's what it's allowing us to reclaim the seat that was always there for us. And that's where I find it empowering. And I do think that particularly younger generations are seeing things differently. So I have a lot of faith in them, because for the younger generations, the world that we grew in, that was so rigid, has changed. So there is a lot of space there. I see that I have 3 children and my youngest is 12. And, sometimes the way that she looks at the world is like, so I do think that there is hope.
Well, thank you for bringing it out to the forefront, because I think we need to bring out more of the feminine energy to balance the masculine energy in this very challenging times now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Penelope Ryder says on YouTube, the more women who speak up, the more we integrate and allow men to do the same. We need to take the shame out of emotions and depression and the showing of our pain.
Yes, that is true. But I also want to show that a lot of the sociologists are men. Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, if you look at the pictures that I have shown and the names that I have given, it is a lot of men, because when you leave the feminine out, you are not just hurting females, you're hurting humankind, you're hurting the psyche of all the living things, because you are, basically destroying reality as it is, right? So right. It's not just something that is detrimental to women, it's detrimental to all.
Yeah, and I want to point out that it's always been the women who pulled civilization back together. The men were always out having a war and getting one another killed. And then it was the women who had to pull things back together, sometimes not in the best way. But, the clear example from the 20th century is the women of Germany who, after World War I, they had so many young men that had been killed, and they had to produce another generation. And they produced another generation that was vengeful and angry because of the way they were treated in the Treaty of Versailles. And and so they pulled civilization back together, but that time in a bad way. But at least people who had wisdom, who are leaders who have wisdom, understood that after World War II, we couldn't be vengeful. We needed to recreate the world and enact the world the way we wanted it. And that's what the Marshall Plans were. And that's why the countries that we fought in World War II became our best allies later on, or among our best allies. I also want to point out that your spectrum idea is very apt, because actually everything is energy. And so at the deepest level, all atoms are a kind of energy, and they're just at different frequencies. And so it's a question of having enough perception so that we can perceive those energies in the right way. And that's how we developed ears and eyes, for example, as species, as living beings, because we could respond to energy by listening and also by seeing in different ways. So we actually naturally created the ways to do these things. So anyway, Nicholas, do you have anything to say? Oh, Eva, go ahead, and then Nicholas, you're next.
No, I just wanted to add to this, in that I think that it's really important, this keeps coming up for us, that when we're incorporating the feminine as she comes through right now, that we remember that we're not countering the masculine, and that as Marian Woodman so often reminded us, the masculine and feminine are not related to gender. They're yang and yin. You know, they're force and form, whatever language. And so they have to come together and dance together. And so bringing in the new feminine is also honoring the masculine.
Very well put, Eva. Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. And Robert Beaton says, profound readings and presentation. Thank you to Elisa for the presentation of wide historical instances of Sophia. Has Elisa come across American Alice O. Howell's writings on finding or discovering Sophia in the commonplace in her book, The Dove in the Stone? Have you come across that, Elisa?
I know her. I know of her because Eva and Vanessa have been kind enough to share her material with me. I have not read the book yet. I have not read the book. However, the connection with birds goes back to even the first goddesses, because the first goddesses, I mean, we always think of the Venus of Willendorf, right? That's our idea of the beginning. But some of the earliest images of goddesses are actually statues that have bird heads. Mm-hmm. And so there is that connection from very early on. And in Russia in particular, when the iconography of Sophia comes, and they have this very active substrate of paganism, the Russians did have several deities that were associated with birds. And there was no way that the church could kick them out. So in the language of the church, they become the bird of paradise, they become the bird of heaven. But then when the art comes, I really believe that the unconscious cannot put that down. And there they are in the icons staring at you, coming back. And there's no other way really that I can explain it. But thank you, Robert, for the recommendation. I will look it up.
Yeah.
Vanessa, I cannot hear you.
Nick, did you have something to say there, Nicholas?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thank you very much, Elisa. This was a phenomenal talk. It helped clear up so many questions that I've had. And I would just like to ask, why do you think, why and also when in Christian thought was what's represented by Sophia or femininity in general, why was it subverted or repressed?
I don't think, well, first of all, you have so many different areas of development of Christian thought that we cannot speak of one. I do believe that it has to do with the conversion of like the church really becoming an institution. That when the church becomes an institution, then it has to respond, an institution associated to a state. So not just the church as the church, but the church as the church and state, because then politics come into play. And then whatever decision that the church needs to take inside the church is going to reflect a political situation of the time. And that is when things really start to get murky, because then whatever happens inside a church needs to happen for a political reason. We see that in the West very clearly, with popes being, you know, people that were corrupt and coming from extremely rich families, and they had to put that person as a pope because that was a political statement. That becomes very clear. I don't think that in the case of the Byzantine Empire that they are any less guilty, really. In that respect, you know, politics and religion have gone hand in hand for the longest time. And we live in a time now where there is more separation, and you know, for Jung, in a way that was a problem, because then the energy is no longer coming from the, you know, the structure of the church. So where is that energy going? But for us, that is also an opportunity to find alternative ways to have an energy that really speaks to us and that really incorporates that feminine aspect.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Excellent. I also wanted to ask, do you think that Sophia has a place in the Father, Son, Holy Ghost? Do you think that she is the Holy Ghost?
Well, traditionally, she was the Holy Ghost. So I tried to condense a lot of research here in a very short time. But we do find, and you can see that in my other webinars, that I show a lot of art in which, you know, when they depict the Trinity, the third aspect of the Trinity is always a female for the longest time. So there are cathedrals in Germany from the Romanesque period in which Sophia, you know, you have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit is clearly a woman. And you have manuscripts, lots of manuscripts. So we have a lot, you know, there's more manuscripts surviving that church art from the time in which the third person of the Trinity is a female, and she has a reddish color to the face. So this association between the third aspect of the Trinity with Sophia is very strong. The other thing that I have to say is when you go to the biblical text, there is never a Trinity. So the concept of the Trinity was developed later in the councils of the church. So they had to, you know, come to terms of who was Jesus. Was he divine? Was he human? What was he? They decide on the dual nature and they settle for that. And then in order to explain a lot of things and reconcile a lot of fractions, they come up with the concept of the Trinity. But the Trinity as itself is never present. If you read the whole Bible, Christian Bible, choose a Bible, read it, there is no Trinity in the Bible. But traditionally, and that is where the work of, you know, of all these other historians come in, there were female deities along Jehovah or Yahweh and along El. So we do know that traditionally there was a female presence there. And it does make sense, because if you look at all the other religions, there's always three, right? There's always the feminine aspect along the masculine. So why, you know, Joseph Campbell said that very nicely. He says, you know, why from all the people in the world, why did the Jewish, you know, leave the female aspect out? I mean,
Yeah.
Well, they were creating structure, weren't they? And the idea of the logos. And one of the things that I always observe is that, you know, in the beginning was the Word, but then didn't anything happen after the Word? And of course, you read 3 more verses and you find that the light and the life came in. Yeah, you get to verse John 1:4 and 5, and you start to see the light and the life. Although the church wanted to intermediate between God and the people, and you know that was quite lucrative and provided a living for a lot of theologians over thousands of years. But you know, we have to understand that you know, the issue was always, oh, Eros is bad. Well, Eros isn't bad because Eros is our life. Okay, and we have to understand that. And so when we need logos, of course, if we look at everything in our room, everything that we have in our room, it's both beautiful. We all bought everything that we have in our rooms because we thought it was beautiful, I presume, or you should throw it away. But none of it is alive. Okay, none of it is alive. It had to be made by perfection, by perfect logos of creating the designs or creating the structure, the philosophical structure, to be able to think about something. But none of it is alive. Our life is in the eros, and that's why I think that the Holy Ghost may be feminine.
It's inanimate.
Everything is inanimate. Yeah, right. Very, very well
I just
put.
wanted to say something to that because I've been working, as you know, with the Tree of Life, with the Kabbalistic tree. And according to Stefan Haller, who is a Gnostic and also a Jungian, within that place, the one light, Sophia contains both the masculine and the feminine and the one light. And in terms of the Trinity in the supernal triangle on the tree, there is within embedded the symbol of the Trinity, simply because there are the two sides and the third being this one light, Sophia energy. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And also the Ruach Elohim being male and female.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Right. And by the way, Evo, on the 26th of October, Nick is going to give a presentation on the tree to my Monday night group. So just for your information, that'll be at 8 p.m. Eastern time on Monday, the 26th of October. So other comments here for Elisa. We don't want to overstay.
Elisa, I'd really like to thank you for resetting the table from going through Hokmah to Sophia to Pneuma to Logos to Sphere to Sanctus, because it tracks through a non-patriarchy reason. And instead of being embattled, one of my parents is a translator, and it's always important to get the right translation before you put your first foot down. There's so many omissions, and the winners write the history. And when you tracked right through just those 5 words, I got tingles because it reset the table from oh, that makes sense, because translation is important. And that it also, the Nancy Pfaff, I think, indicated that it shows clearly the evolution of language. And in just those 5 words, you kind of ran through a whole spine of a discussion topic, which I find just of vast interest. So thank you.
Well, thank you for saying that. And most important, I think what it does also, it doesn't really point fingers, because one of the shadows of this discussion is to start, pointing finger. Well, it's a patriarchy, or it was the Romans, or it was whomever. And a lot of times it's just really bad luck, because, yes, it is bad luck. And
right.
We also see that with the Russians in terms of translations. The reason why Sophia makes it to the north so strongly is because we have the Slavs, they don't read Greek. So how do you import a religion from Constantinople to the Slavs? Well, you need a translation. And it's usually the Bulgarians that translate the text, because the Bulgarians are in between the two lands. And so they are more exposed to Greek. But the Greek words, they don't translate right into Slavic. So you try to translate that theology and it just doesn't stick. It becomes meaningless. So the things that are easy to translate are the wisdom books, the Tale of Solomon, because it has, all this language that is easy for people to understand. And so what the Bulgarians do is they translate very select pieces of the Bible. And one of the pieces that makes it through is the wisdom tradition. And because of that, Sophia can be more present in the north. So that's also, like it or not, a matter of choice based on language ability, because there's concepts that are in the Greek language that are too theological or too profound or too complex to be translated into Old Slavonic. Now, of course, Old Slavonic evolves, and now we have a Russian language that is very apt for theology. But at the time, that was also one of the restricting factors.
I just want to remind everyone of our talk with Becca Tarnas from a month ago, in which she was talking about transpersonal psychology and about enactment and how we enact the world that we live in. And it seemed to me, and one of the reasons I got pretty excited about Elisa's talk was that it's a very clear demonstration of the enactment of the emergence of the feminine, and over 2,000 years and across the maps of the Middle East and Central Russia, and that was an enactment that was enacted differently in the West. And so if we want the feminine to come forward again now, it has to be enacted. If not us, who? If not now, when? It's like that it is our enactment with the divine, because the divine is definitely there, as folks who are talking with me about the tarot know, that there are these archetypal energies that are present and they're undeniable, and okay, we can't draw a picture of them and we can't touch them, but nonetheless they're present. And so it's up to us to enact within the context of those energies what we want in the world. And that's the point of inviting Elisa here, in part, because I think it's important to bring
Elisa,
it forward.
I'd like to thank you, and your clarity helps us recognize the qualities and the history of Sophia. And we know that throughout time, women have been leaders. And it is a matter of recognition. Almost every week, some woman or women get in the news who have not been recognized, but who have developed science, medicine, physics in every field. On Tuesday, I'm going to a museum of the last witch who was killed in Switzerland. And I think about, why and how so many women were not recognized, or recognized through torture or something negative. So your talk is just really uplifting, and the idea of recognizing these things which Skip has said and Joss, they're everywhere all the time for us to live and do something with, if we can recognize and have support from these ideas. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Vanessa. Vanessa has been very faithful following my work. I believe you have been in every chat that I had given. Thank you, Vanessa. But I do believe, they usually say, in order to see a problem, we have to name it. I also believe that in order to see a gift, we have to name it.
Yes, and
part of reclaiming Sophia is seeing where she has been, because we come from a culture that has, Sophia in many representations is veiled.
Yes.
We need to remove that veil. We need to make her known.
Very good point.
When this tradition comes forward, when we see that it's not just the Gnostics, because people tend to dismiss the Gnostic and say, oh, you Jungians and the Gnostics, but it's not just the Gnostics, it's across the spectrum.
It's us.
Right, and it affects everybody. So once we know this, we have tools to empower the coming generations, because,
Precisely.
This is something that is in your DNA. This is your right to incorporate this. This is not something that you need to ask permission for. It's yours to begin with.
Yeah, and you can't write it off, because the Gnostics talked about it in the 3rd century and they were all killed by the Romans. The heck with that. It's here now. I don't know squat about Gnosticism, honestly, and I've been studying Jungian psychology for 33 years, so I couldn't tell you what a Gnostic believes. The only thing I know that they were about was having a direct experience with God, and once you've had that experience, then you know, and until you've had it, you don't know, and so if that's Gnostic, okay, I don't care, you know, if you want to call it Gnostic or call it what you like, but it's what we need now is to understand. Anna Alyssa Romo makes a comment here. Isn't the Holy Ghost related to action, the verb? I don't believe it's inanimate. Well, certainly it's not inanimate, and certainly it's present. And you know, what Christ said, what Christ promised, and I haven't actually laid eyes on it in the Bible. I'm not a theologian, but according to Edward Edinger, so this is a secondhand source, Christ promised the Paraclete to come, and the Paraclete was the Holy Ghost. And when his disciples were trying to persuade him out of going to the cross because they knew that his actions were going to cause him to be executed, he said, but you see, I have to leave so the Paraclete can come. And the point was that as long as he was there as the leader and as you know, a local religious guru, he probably would have been nothing. But because he went to the cross and his legend, what he perceived what it would be, and it has become, you know, there's no question that he was the God-man, the Son of God, and the Paraclete could only come when he was gone. And so the Holy Ghost infused the disciples, and now has infused a quarter of the human species in Christianity in various forms. And so now we have to understand how that comes into our own lives. And it comes to in our own lives in very many ways. And of course, Jung said at the end of Answer to Job that we all become sons and daughters of God.
Well, I just wanted to add, thank you so much, Elisa. I'm not a Christian, so this is, I'm hoping to even transcend that concept on that level. But thank you so much for this and for bringing the iconography, beautiful iconography, and the history of Sophia, because without the past, we can't bring forth the future. And so thank you again for your continuing research and the beauty and clarity with which you bring this forth. I'm so grateful.
Yeah, thank you, Eva, for introducing me to Alyssa in the first place. By the way, I have a daughter named Alyssa, but it's spelled differently. But it's spoken in the same way. So anything else? Anybody else want to say anything? Go ahead, Jordan.
Quick question. Something you just said was really powerful. It struck me when you said to lift the veil. I thought about the chemical wedding of alchemy and the marriage of self, and that we literally need to lift that veil within us to then emanate that in the participatory mystique act outside. And the second piece I wanted to say is, especially with the Russian influence, they never lost their paganism, so they never lost their connection to nature. So they are then ripe to spread it back because the seeds will repopulate the garden, basically. So I thought that was pretty interesting that it took several hundred years, and that they just still had that natural piece to them, because again, the language wouldn't translate. So they, in a sense, had an immunity from language that couldn't carry the great concepts.
Yes, Jordan, and I find it interesting. So the concept of nature is huge within Orthodoxy as well. So when we think about Christianity in the West, we talk about the Virgin Mary, but for the Russians, it was never, they couldn't care less that she was a virgin, because it was always Theotokos, so the mother of God. So their focus is on creation. Their focus is on fertility. And you have to think that these people live in a land that you really depend on the fertility of the land, because, you know, if you're in the Mediterranean and you have a bad crop year, you fish. If you are in Russia and you have a bad crop year, you starve. Okay, so the relationship to nature is fundamental. And for the Orthodoxy in particular, there is always this connection between the sacred matter. So if you look at theology from the point of view of Orthodoxy, there's always the looking for the sacredness in the matter. So when Marian Woodman speaks about, you know, matter becoming luminous again and matter having the sacredness again, that is a concept that is present in their theology. I'm not saying that is a concept that is super important in their theology now, but it is there, you know, and it's there from the beginning. And it was one of the main, not the main issues for separation, but you could clearly see two schools of thought in terms of the East separating from the West, and but it's really present in the history of the East. Yeah.
I think
Thank
that,
you. There's a concept I had called matter is spent light. And you've kind of re-energized, it's 20 years old and I haven't written on it in forever, but you just re-energized that. And I appreciate that. And it's literally the direct influence of they never lost their nature. Brilliant connections you've made.
well, I think that you've also shown us one thing. I have to tip my hat to the anonymous movement, because they coined the phrase that you can't kill an idea. And, you know, what you've just shown us over a 2-century or 3-century, maybe, not century, millennia period, is that the ideas of the sacred feminine cannot be killed, and they keep reemerging and pressing themselves forward. And as we have now a global internet, and all these ideas cannot be kept in the bottle any longer, they're going to come up in myriad ways that we can't even imagine. It's just fascinating to watch. For me, it was fascinating to watch when my male counterparts in Saudi Arabia in hospitals where I was working for quite a long time were arguing about why women couldn't be allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia. And they finally were the last of the 56 Muslim nations to allow women to drive about 2 years ago. But the arguments that the men came up with for why women shouldn't be allowed to drive were just hilarious, actually. And with all due respect to my male counterparts in Saudi Arabia, who I cherish greatly, but you know, those ideas weren't really there. And finally, the women had their way. It took them a long while, but so.
I think
anyway.
that's a good analogy. And the women didn't think it was very funny.
No, the women didn't think it was funny at all.
But it's the same. It's exactly the same.
And
situation.
You know, and the men, you know, would say, "Oh, well, we have drivers, so why should they want to drive? They have drivers." Well, okay, and the group that I was dealing with, yes, they had drivers, but you know, there were literally millions of people in Saudi Arabia that cannot afford to import drivers from India or Pakistan or the Philippines. And so we need to develop things in our own countries too. So anyway, other comments before we wrap up? Thank you so much, Elisa, for being with us. Are you selling your icons then? Are they on your website? Are you selling them on your website?
No, unfortunately, I am not. I use them myself. I give them to family and friends.
I see.
What I do have is I just launched my website in English because I work mostly in Spanish, and it's thefieryangel.academy. And I'm hoping to upload the webinars there at one point. I am working on the audio, and I am working now on a fourth one, basically talking about the paganism in Russia and connecting it to the birds, because I think that that's an area that is absolutely fascinating, but I'm still reading. That's what I do in the evenings. I don't do Netflix. I do reading. One day I will do Netflix. But thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Thank you, Lillian, for this wonderful discussion. Thank you all.
So I do need to do one advertisement, which is next week on Saturday, we will have Jungian analyst Gary Sparks, who is going to speak about the Systema Mundatotius, I think he calls it, which is the first mandala that C.G. Jung created. And he has sent out a series of PDFs to look at in advance of that, and he wants us to have them available to us. So I will be sending out another notice about that in the next week or the next day or two, including the links to his website where you can get these PDFs. And so that's next Saturday. And then let's see, 2 weeks from today, I think it is, I believe it's the 25th of October, we have Steve Booser, who's one of the publishers of Chiron Publications, who's going to talk about the world of BTS, which is what he has written about in collaboration with Mary Stein. And that should be a rock'em sock'em event, because when Mary was here, we had nearly 500 people watching at one point. So anyway, I hope you all sign up in the registration for these sessions, and thank you all for being here.
Before we wrap up, Elisa, do you have time for one more question?
A quick one, yes.
Yeah, I was just curious, kind of based on what Jordan said, have you done any research into Sophia and alchemy?
That is Eva's area, so I leave it to her. She's the expert, so I bow to her in terms of alchemy, because alchemy is more, so there's a lot on alchemy, but she's done enough work on that. I have gone more into the historical part with the Eastern world, so I haven't really gone into alchemy. Eva is doing now actually a class on alchemy and Sophia. So, maybe she would be better to answer a question that you have on that topic.
Okay.
Eva, do you have a response?
Myself? Oops.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, my class is just started. We're doing 11-part series on Sophia Sparks, and that's on the Kabbalistic tree, then the alchemy, and Sophia's return. So there's a lot of Jung and Marian intertwined in this, but yes, it's going to be very focused on the alchemy.
Right.
Where can I find that?
You can find it on my website, which is, I'll put it down here. It's www.reclaimingsoul.com.
I was thinking of some of the pictures which Elisa had shown of Sophia as a red figure, and I was looking through a book I have here, and I found all these different alchemical photos of Sophia in a tree, completely red, and then
yes, she has this Saturnian element on her. Yes, that is an image that actually Eva is using now in her class. So I highly recommend her work. That's a whole other area to go into. So, when you do a presentation, you really have to choose a focus. Sure. But in that respect, I really recommend Eva's work. She's fantastic.
Yeah, and I am taking Eva's course. We've had the first session so far, and it's Eva, as usual, has done how many thousands of slides. So she really teaches it extremely thoroughly.
Excellent. Well, thank you for the recommendation and taking the last question. And it's great to be with you all.
Okay, and tomorrow night in our Tarot class, we'll be dealing with the Hermit, just for those of you who are interested in learning about the Tarot. So see you again soon. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you so much, Elisa, for being here with us today. Bye-bye.